Welcome everyone. Good morning. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Praxia Apostle. I'm the Director of Learning here at ISKL, and I'll be moderating our talk today with Professor Simran Singh. So welcome to VOX at ISKL. This is a platform that we hope inspires, ignites, and informs others of current issues and trends. And we're so happy to be joined by people who are part of our ISKL community and our wider community in Malaysia and around the world. So welcome, good morning, good evening, good afternoon from wherever you're joining. Just before we get started here, I'd like to just go over a few housekeeping pointers. So please stay muted throughout the presentation. We really appreciate that. We're a small group, but we want to stay as quiet as possible. So if you have any questions as Professor Singh is giving his talk today, please be sure to drop them into the chat. We'll be keeping track of those and have a Q&A session that follows the talk today. If you'd like to rename yourself in Zoom, you can rename yourself with your first name by clicking on your video, the three dots there in the corner, and then clicking rename. This session is recorded, and it will be published on the ISKL website and the YouTube channel as well. All right, so that's all of our housekeeping details. So today it's my pleasure to also introduce our head of school, Mr. Rami Madani. So Rami, thank you for being with us today.
Welcome everyone, and thank you, Professor Singh, for being with us today. We're all excited to learn from you. We believe that at the heart of any organization, there are values. Good organizations, however, pay attention to these values. They pay attention and demonstrate it by the way they reflect on their values, the way they learn and improve their values, especially during hard times. We believe that ISKL is highly committed to looking deeply at its values and questioning them and learning together individually and collectively. There is no time more important than now for us, regardless where we are in the world, to learn from each other, to have the courage and the trust to travel that journey, to reflect on our values. And we are very delighted that you are part of this journey with us, Professor Singh, today, and the participants. And we look forward to today's learning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rami. It's now my honor and my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Simran Singh. Simran is a Sikh-American award-winning author, educator, activist, and scholar who speaks regularly and writes regularly on topics of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. We were very lucky to have Professor Singh with us. He presented to our elementary students during Book Week in March, and to our high school students in April during their advisory session. Today he's speaking with us about our values and how it's never felt more urgent to start instilling these values that are so important in ourselves and one another and for our children. And so without more from me, I'll pass it over to Professor Singh to get us started with his talk for today. Thank you and welcome, Professor Singh.
Thank you, Praxia. Thank you all for being here, and hello from New York City. Evening is wrapping up here now, and I spent a lot of today thinking about what to share with you this evening. And I did that because I want to honor your time by trying to make our session meaningful and as worthwhile as possible. And so my intention for our time together is to share some insights and reflections around the idea of values and values-based living. And as part of that, we'll do some exercises together to bring it all to life. And then we'll have some nice conversation together at the end. So that's my intention for the evening. And I want to start by sort of taking you on a journey with me, my own journey through values-based living. And it really starts with my childhood. I was born and raised in Texas, in South Texas, to immigrant parents. My parents immigrated to the United States from Punjab, a region in northwestern India and modern-day Pakistan. And so I don't know why they thought it would be a great idea to raise my three brothers and me as brown-skinned, turban wearing, beard loving guys in South Texas of all places. But they did, and we grew up there. And there were a lot of experiences we had there growing up that we wouldn't have had otherwise. And so I'm really grateful for all of that. And what I would say is, one of my earliest moments in thinking about values, and I'll share a few along the way, because I think this is also for me as a parent now, thinking about how do we instill values, not just how we practice them, but then how do we bring these along into our families, into our organizations, into our communities. That's what I'm really thinking about. So as a kid, money was tight in our immigrant family when we were growing up. We rarely went out to restaurants because, as my mom would say, why do you want to eat out? I can make it better for you at home. And my father would always reply, and it was, the four of us would just roll our eyes at this conversation, but my dad would always reply and say, your mom's food is so good, a restaurant couldn't even make anything like this. And so, of course, we knew that they just didn't want to pay for us to have a night out at a restaurant. And now that I'm older, I actually have the opposite problem, because when it's my night to cook, everyone in my household, my wife and my kids, they ask for restaurant food instead. So it's funny how the tables turn. My mom's cooking is what made me first love going to the grocery store, because every aisle was an adventure, every conversation was a lesson, and it's where my mom first started treating me like an equal. She would ask my opinions, she would request my help. She taught me how to look for bruises on tomatoes, just like her mother had taught her. She told me stories of acquiring food back in India, a place with no grocery stores or even centralized location for food supplies. And she'd talk about her family's own food insecurity, about how they skip meals sometimes to ensure they wouldn't go hungry later, how her parents quietly rationed their own food so their children would have enough to eat. It was from her that I learned to think of an American grocery store as a refuge, with its wide open aisles, its high ceilings, and more food than she could have ever imagined growing up in India. And she would look around with amazement and gratitude every time we entered the store. And it's one of my favorite memories as a child growing up in the United States. And I'll share a story that I'm actually a little bit embarrassed to share, but I think it might be instructive in some way. I was 12 years old when our weekly ritual of going to the grocery store together came to an end. And it was a sudden end because one day we were at the store checkout counter, and when she wasn't looking, I grabbed a Snickers bar and put it in my pocket. And I glanced up to make sure she wasn't looking, and she was. And I saw her eyes widen, and I was so ashamed. I didn't have the courage to hold eye contact. I just took the bar out of my pocket. I handed it to her. She put it on the counter and she paid for it along with the rest of the groceries. And neither of us spoke the whole way home. I put away the groceries in silence. I went to her room to apologize. And there was a lump in my throat as I tried to speak, and the words barely came out of my mouth. And I stood patiently waiting for her to announce my punishment and to tell me how upset she was with me. And instead she looked at me and she asked a question that I wasn't expecting. She said, "Do you know why you wear a turban?" I wasn't sure what she wanted me to say. My mind raced trying to think of whatever it might be that she was hoping to hear from me. But nothing seemed to connect with shoplifting, with what I had done. And so I shook my head and said no. And she asked if I heard the story of Guru Tegh Bahadur, the 9th teacher of the Sikhs. And I said, yes, I had. And that story had made a huge impression on me. When a group of Kashmiri Hindus, Brahmins, were facing religious persecution by the Mughal emperor, the 9th teacher of the Sikhs stood up for them. He didn't believe the same things as them. He didn't belong to the same community as them. Yet he was willing to take the risk to show up for others when they were in trouble. Now, I knew the story. I had no idea what it had to do with my current situation. And so I recounted that to my mom, and she smiled at me for the first time since the incident at the store. And then she asked, "But do you know what happened after that?" And she then shared a story that was new to me, a story that changed how I saw myself and how I wanted to live in the world. Our story was about Guru Tegh Bahadur, who was seen as a powerful leader with a sizable and growing community. And the emperor tried to make a public example out of him, publicly imprisoning him, torturing him, executing him. And when he was killed, as he was being tortured, none of his followers were willing to stand up and speak for justice, to do the right thing. And the story goes that his son, who would be the next guru for the Sikhs, Guru Gobind Singh, decided there would no longer be a possibility for people in his tribe to blend into the crowd instead of stepping forward to do the right thing. He believed that people, truly devout people, truly good people, should live by their convictions unconditionally, and that they wouldn't be able to hide in fear if they were more publicly identifiable, more visible. And many believe that this feeling is what prompted the Sikh Guru, the 10th Guru, to bestow a distinctive appearance that Sikhs would hold on their heads, and that the appearance, the identity, would hold them accountable to the values that they professed. So my mom tells me the story, and then she says, "There's nothing sacred about looking like a Sikh. Your turban is a public statement that you wear on your head. It's a crown that announces to the world that you will always do the right thing. And if you're not willing to honor that, then maybe you should stop wearing it." And that final comment caught me completely off guard, because for years my mother had taught me to resist anyone who told me to take off my turban. And now she was asking if I deserved to wear one in the first place. And that sting that I felt in that moment, it made me feel defensive. Instead of focusing on her point, I wanted to refute her. I wanted to explain that my decision to pocket a Snickers bar had no effect, that it was an anomaly, I'd never done it before, that it was a minor mistake, that it didn't hurt anyone, that no one knew because no one saw besides her. And I didn't say any of this because I knew in my heart that my mother was talking about something different. She was talking about the importance of always doing the right thing, whether people are looking or not. She was talking about integrity. And her guidance in that moment was calm, yet firm, simple, yet transformative. Because it was through her that I first learned about the inseparable relationship between integrity, accountability, and inner happiness. Now, the point about the grocery store incident is this. There was no question in my mind that I was doing the wrong thing. I was old enough to know better, which is why I tried to make sure that no one could see what I was doing. I realize now that I wasn't just ashamed of being caught. There was a deeper shame that came in knowingly doing the wrong thing. I knew what I was doing. I knew I was betraying my values, even before I even reached for the candy bar. And yet I chose to do it anyway. Now, being caught meant that I had to deal with the discomfort of being reprimanded. It also meant that I had to deal with my own internal disconnection. Why did I choose to do something I knew I was wrong? What did it mean that a momentary desire for something so menial, a Snickers bar, had overpowered my inner voice? Could I really trust myself to do the right thing when the stakes were higher? Now, the grocery store incident for me, it may seem like a random moment to you, but to me personally, it was an inflection point. And I share it because we all have moments like these. My account reflects the decisions that we all make each and every day. We're making choices constantly, and it can be easy for us to dismiss or minimize the impact of each. And it could also be easy for us to justify or cover for our poor decisions by making excuses to ourselves and to the people around us. We say, it's okay to eat this because I had a hard day at work. I couldn't call you back because I ran out of time. It was fair for me to shout because they messed up. It was their fault. And we may be fooling the people around us, but we know deep down, all of us, that we're being dishonest with ourselves and with the people we love. We can't fool our own hearts. And the cost of dishonesty, like this, it's too high. It breeds negative feelings that we come to internalize and embody. So when we act in ways that don't match up with our ideals, we feel more disconnection. We feel more disappointment. We feel more guilt. We feel ashamed of our behavior, and over time, we come to feel ashamed of ourselves. These were the feelings that afflicted me after the shoplifting incident. And although they've waxed and waned over the years since, those feelings are still very much familiar to me. I think they're familiar to all of us. When we betray our values, we also weaken the trust we have in ourselves. Doubt creeps into our hearts and into our minds. It corrodes our self-confidence. And how can we love ourselves if we don't respect ourselves? Now, on the other hand, what I want to submit today is that the opposite is also true. Aligning our ideals and our behaviors can instill self-confidence. Each decision can be empowering and trust-building because it can show us that we have the capacity to do what's right. Think about the last time you successfully resisted something tempting, an extravagant purchase, that last slice of cake, skipping your weekly fitness class. Now think about how you felt the moment you resisted. Didn't you feel proud? Weren't you energized by knowing that you could do it? I know this is true for you because it's true for all of us. We each have these struggles and we each have our victories. It's what makes us human. The problem is we don't realize that our daily decisions, our minute-by-minute decisions, can make the difference between a life of joy and a life of shame. Every decision matters because every decision shapes who we are and who we become. Philosophers had argued, from the early Greeks to modern day philosophers, they've argued that our daily decisions are seeds that grow into our habits and ultimately into our character. We tend to focus on the decisions that have tangible results, things that we can measure. Will executing this project help me secure a promotion? Will I get caught if I cheat on this homework? Will taking this trip exceed my budget? And yet, as with so much in life, the real treasure is not something we can see with our eyes or feel with our hands. The real power of what we do is that our behavior will either take us towards happiness or away from it. And this is why I believe it's so important that we stop measuring what we do exclusively on the basis of tangible outcomes. What we do matters, first and foremost, because our actions and our behaviors shape who we become. That's what we should be focusing on. To be clear, this is not a point about morality, right? I'm not here to proclaim what is right or wrong, or even what values you should describe for yourself. Our ideals, our values are personal and context specific. So only you can determine what is right or wrong for yourself. My point here is about unlocking something powerful that is already available to each of us. Because if we can see our everyday choices as opportunities to practice our values, we can strengthen our own feelings of self-connection and self-worth. When we're unaware of how our choices affect us, we tend to choose without intention. Our decisions become a randomized series. Some may make us feel proud, others may make us feel regret, but they don't really take us anywhere. We get little out of them aside from the momentary pleasure or pain of each decision. Without intention, it becomes hard to see our actions, positive or negative. as anything more than random. There's not enough rhyme or reason to our behavior. At best, that makes it hard for us to replicate what makes us joyful. At worst, it leaves us dazed from the constant ups and downs, twists and turns of our lives. Without purpose behind our actions, we're stuck on our emotional roller coasters, wanting nothing more than to get off the ride, but not even sure how to do that. So what I believe values-based living offers us is a simple exit strategy off of this roller coaster that we can all engage, we can all understand. Because if we can learn to see our daily decisions as devices to help us produce pattern behavior, to help build our personal character, then we can become more mindful about our actions. So that's the why. Why does it matter? Why do values matter? That's what we've covered. And now I want to move into the how. How do we actually do this? It's not easy. And I want to start with a story of a friend of mine named Jagmeet Singh. In 2017, Jagmeet Singh was a member of the Canadian Parliament, leader of the New Democratic Party, one of the larger political parties in Canada. And the story, I think, exemplifies the power of living our ideals in the current political context and gives us a glimpse into how we begin moving into this. So at a 2017 campaign event for Jagmeet in Ontario, Canada, a woman began yelling racist hate speech at him. Now, Jagmeet Singh is a Sikh like myself. He wears a turban and beard too. And when this woman started yelling at him, rather than yelling back, which is often the most natural impulse, instead of yelling back, Jagmeet and his reporter and his supporters responded by chanting two words: love and courage, love and courage. This was his campaign slogan, love and courage, derived from his own core values. Jagmeet patiently, there's video of this, and you can, feel free to look it up on a quick search. But Jagmeet responds patiently to this woman who was yelling at him by leading into these two values that he espoused and that he announced, explaining that despite her anger and her hate, he loved her, he respected her, and he would protect her rights. Later, in an interview about this event, Jagmeet said the following: "Once allowed to grow, hate doesn't pick and choose, it spreads like fire. Once we say it's okay to hate someone based on their religion, we're also opening the door to hate based on race, gender, sexuality, and more. It's important that we stand united against all forms of hate. It takes love to understand we are all in this together. It takes courage to come together, demand better, and dream bigger, so that we can build a world where no one is left behind." Jagmeet Singh won his election that year and went on to become the first person of color to lead a major political party in Canadian history. And he also won more than that. His ability to maintain his poise and his values in the face of a racist tirade in public inspired people all over the world. He showed that we all have the capacity to respond to hate with love, even in extremely difficult situations. Jagmeet's example also shows how helpful it can be to have clearly identified values to lean on in times of difficulty. It's clear through his words and actions that these two values, love and courage, guided his response to this woman. And moreover, his response shows how powerful and how beautiful it can be when we adhere to our values with integrity and authenticity. Now, I saw this event unfold, and the questions that came to my mind immediately were, where does this type of real and unflinching commitment to his values come from? And how do we get some of that for ourselves? Like, how do we do that? And I think from what I've learned, this form of ethical living entails two key components. One, clearly identifying, articulating, and understanding our values. So that's one. identifying our values. What are they? What are we here for? And two, putting those values into practice. Because it's only when we respond with our values on a day-to-day basis, so that they are ingrained in our hearts and minds, that we're prepared to respond with them even in the toughest of situations. I'll share that my own personal introduction to values-based living came before I was ready for it. And it only came because my parents were intent on instilling values in my brothers and me at a very young age. When we were in elementary school, we had to complete 2 rituals before our family dinner every evening. First, we had to offer a prayer of thanks for all our blessings, including the food sitting on the table. And then my father would ask every single night, what makes the world go around? And my brothers and I, again, we would roll our eyes. We'd give our smart-ass answers like, the Earth's centripetal force makes the world go around, or the secret garden gnome within all of us, or something ridiculous like that. And we'd laugh, including our parents, but that didn't mean they gave in. We didn't get to eat until finally one of us would run out of patience and just give the answer. We'd blurt it out and we'd say love. Love is what makes the world go around. And we then dig in as our parents facilitated a dinner conversation on the power of love. When we were in middle school, my parents brought home the Book of Virtues, a large anthology of poems, parables, stories from Western traditions. And the book was thematically organized by individual value. And it became like a second scripture in our home. It sat on top of the fireplace, and every evening, after reciting the Sikh evening prayer read us, we take a selection from the book, and whatever we read would then become fodder for our dinner conversation. Now, the real force of this came when we were in high school. My parents began to organize quarterly family meetings. And to our chagrin, and in spite of our protests, we were expected to block off an entire Sunday, once every 3 months, just for these meetings. Not what you want to be doing when you're a teenager. And my parents would arrive with a glimmer in their eyes, excited to share their latest wisdom from leadership trainings they had undergone. And my 3 brothers and I would complain through all of it, even when we were secretly appreciating what we were learning. When I was a junior in high school, we had a session that was actually 2 days that I didn't expect. It was by a man named Larry Mills, a good friend of my father's, and we would have never agreed to 2 days until when we refused to agree until we finally heard that he worked with our beloved basketball team, the San Antonio Spurs, and then we said, okay, we'll hang out with this guy and listen to what he has to say. And so we sat. And we listened to him, and we talked about basketball when he first arrived, of course. And then we moved into our plan for that weekend. And what he told us was we were going to develop a document that articulated our family's mission statement, vision statement, and a set of shared values. And of course, again, we're teenagers. We do not want to be doing this. Our excitement is gone immediately. But we get there into the painstaking process of developing these 3 components. And what was interesting was the process. We started by listing everything that was important to us. Then we spent the next 2 days organizing, narrowing down, and refining what we meant. And I wouldn't have mentioned it to our parents then, but even as a 16-year-old, I found it instructive to spend so much time thinking and talking about what mattered most. It helped me better understand myself, and it helped me better understand my family. And I'll read to you the mission statement that we developed then. It says, we are the Gaur Singh family, committed to developing and supporting ourselves and each other in all aspects. We do this to achieve continuity, harmony, and stability, strengthen individual and collective well-being, maximize our potential, and develop strong future generations. We accomplish this by implementing and living our family's 5 core values: faith, integrity, love, service, and excellence. Now, here's the thing. My brothers and I participated in this process out of respect for my parents and for Mr. Mills, but I had no idea that this single exercise would serve me for years to come. I definitely didn't expect that it would change my life. 2 decades later, I still consult it almost daily as I work through decisions. It hangs on a frame over at my bed, over my office at my desk, over my desk at my office. I have a digital version on my phone. I have a copy of it on my desktop on this laptop I'm talking to you from. I consult it often. And here's why I think it works. Because for me, detailed instructions and rigid rules have always been hard. I've always felt that life is too dynamic and complex for formulas. Anytime people give definitive directives, I find myself rebelling and wanting to do the exact opposite, because the feeling I have is, how could one specific prescription apply to all of humanity when no single one of us is the same? And I think the values approach, the values framework, it resonates with me because there's no set of rules that dictate our lives for us. Rather, it offers us a framework that we can interpret and apply to our own life situations. And I appreciate that it allows for us and accounts for us. It allows for us to account for the particularities of our own lived realities. So I'll pause here and actually invite us into a little exercise. And you can probably anticipate what it would be. But I want you to take a moment, and you don't have to share this with everyone in the room, but I want you to just take a moment, let's say 90 seconds, and just give us a mission statement. It doesn't have to be polished. It doesn't have to be perfect. But what are you here for? What's your mission in this world? What do you aspire to do? So I'll give you 90 seconds there, and then I'll come back your way. Okay, great. Here's the next invitation for you as an exercise. I am going to invite you to, again, doesn't have to be your final list, but take a few moments and just think about, what are your core values? And here's a way for us to do it, actually. I invite you to, if you have access, to type in whatever you're feeling into the chat. What are some values that speak to you? Don't feel limited to round it out to 3 or 5 or any magic number, but just share with us, what are some of the values that really stick out to you as things that ground you and how you want to live in this world? Family, honesty, integrity, compassion, hard work, love, courage, authenticity, brave, kind, gratitude, growth, integrity, relationships, being better every day, empathy, simplicity, courage. Wonderful, this is great. One of the things you'll notice, and feel free to keep dropping them in here, one of the things you'll notice is there's overlap, right? Some of these terms are being repeated. There's also diversity. Some people are saying things that other people aren't. And one thing you might even find is that there are some, I haven't seen any of these yet, but there are values that often are perceived to rub up against one another. Right, some people might feel that one of their values is to be transparent to the world, and somebody else might say, well, that I would rather keep things close to the vest, and that's important to my way of living. That's fine. I think that's all fine. I think what's really valuable here is to be intentional about how we want to live in this world, and so often we fail to do that, right? We have these general signposts of, here are the things that matter to me, and if asked, we can dump them out into a Zoom chat. But what are we actually doing to live by those? So here, I'll actually share with you. I pulled it up from my desktop. This is my family's list, and again, no prescription here. I'm not saying anyone's family values should reflect ours. But I'll tell you a few things that I find to be really helpful with this document. The first is the mission statement, which is not my personal mission statement, right? This is my family's. And so to recognize where you're coming from in developing this, if you're doing it as a shared project, an organizational project, a community project, or a personal one, it'll look different. But the mission statement really helps you understand, if you're doing it for more than yourself, how you relate and connect with other people. What's your shared purpose? The second thing is, as we developed our values, what we were finding was, and this is true with any group of people you'll meet, these words mean different things to everyone. There are people in my family who think of faith very differently than how I understand it. There are people in my family who think of love very differently. And so spending time not just on identifying what the values are, but what do they actually look like? How do they show up? What would success look like? And in doing that, you can then determine what is the actual practice. And I think that's the key question that we so often miss. What does putting your values into practice look like? And so I want to share one more story with you here that I think really beautifully embodies this particular thing, at least in my life. And it's another one that takes me back to childhood. And so I was in 4th grade. My older brother, he's a year older than me, he was in 5th grade. And he had his end of the year class party. And my mother took us, all 4 of us, she had us in tow. And she took us to a roller skating rink where the party was. And we'd been to this roller skating rink dozens of times. It was right next to the fields where we had our baseball and our soccer matches. And so we were there pretty often. But there was a new manager that day. And as he walks in, as we walk in to the roller skating rink, he rushes over immediately and shouts in his Texas twang. He says, get out of here with those damn rags on your heads. Get out of here with those damn rags on your heads. He says that a couple of times, a little more angrily than how I just shared it. But he's upset. And, of course, we're kids, but the natural response would be for us to get upset too. But as you might know, when you face the situation regularly, it doesn't bother you so much. And so my brothers and I, even though we were young, we'd been in these situations before, and we said, okay, we know what to do. And what we did was we ditched our mom and we let her handle it. And we went over to the arcade and stepped away from our mom and hoped that she would be able to do it. And we'd never been in a situation before where she didn't. And so after 10 minutes or so, we were playing at the arcade. She still hadn't resolved it. All our friends were skating and we were starting to get antsy. And so I walked back over to my mom. And she had her back to me. I pulled on her kameez, her Punjabi suit, from the back. And she turns around and she's crying. And I'd never seen her cry before. And I didn't know what to do. And I was a kid and I just started crying as well, because it just felt like what was appropriate. And she looks at me and she grabs me by the shoulder and she leans down and she says, why are you crying? What's wrong? And I said, it's not fair. They should let us skate. What they're doing is wrong. And she says, oh, you're crying because you're upset. Well, I'm crying because I'm happy. And I said, how could you be happy? What's going on here? This makes no sense. Do you understand the situation? And she says, well, I'm happy because I told all the parents and the teachers what was going on, and they all agreed that they would walk out with us together. And, it's this beautiful moment for me. Even 30 years later, I still remember it pretty vividly, right? So it made this real impression on me of This feeling where for the first time in my life, it felt like the people around me had my back, that they would show up for me, that they would go to bat for me, right? Like this really sort of heartful experience that the people around me actually care about me. And so that was great. And it turned out fine because we went across the street to the ice cream place, and I'd much rather have ice cream than go roller skating. So it was a win. But there's more to that story than that. And it is, even as a fourth grader, 10 years old or so, I could look at my mom and recognize that something remarkable had happened. That here was a woman who should have felt completely helpless, right? You're living in a new country, your kids are getting discriminated against, there's nothing you can do to change it. And she's happy, and she finds a way out of that moment. I mean, it's incredible. I have kids of my own now, actually pretty close to the age I was, and I mean, I can't imagine how I would respond. And there are a few specific things that come out of this for me in terms of what values look like when they are put into practice, right? So for my mom in that moment to find optimism, if you remember from that document that I shared, optimism is actually one of our, it's one of our core beliefs as Sikhs. We call it Chardi Kala, living with everlasting positivity. But it's also one of the values that our family developed, that we identified. And so for her in this moment to find a silver lining, but it's not just that, she actually made the silver lining, right? It's not that she could passively sit there and point to something good that was coming out of this. She made something good come out of this. And how did she do that? Community. She looked at the people around her and she gave them the chance to care. Right? It would have been so easy. I mean, the easiest thing for her to do would be to pack us up, the four of us, and say, let's get back in the car and let's go home. Your friends can enjoy their party and we'll miss this one. Easiest option, probably the one that I would go for. Actually, an easier option would have been for her to back down from her principles and say, let's just take off your turbans and you can skate with your hair down. Incredibly easy option, right? She didn't even consider that. She also didn't pack us up to go. She talked to the people around her and gave them a chance to care. She created the opportunity for solidarity. And you can look at this story and say, well, this is what a parent would do out of love for their child. And I think that's true. But when faced with a tough decision, what prepares us to show up in the way that we will feel proud of when our kids are being discriminated against? I think that's the challenge, right? Like, of course, all of us, including myself, would go to bat for our kids. But the question is how? And how do you prepare yourself to do it in a way that you'll feel proud? And it takes us back to this question of values. And here's something that I believe sincerely, firmly, with everything in my heart, because it's my lived experience, that when you daily live with your values, when you put them into practice every single day, you create a stronger ethical fortitude inside of yourself. It's what the French philosopher Foucault calls technologies of the self. He says discipline isn't about the random rituals that we do every day. The discipline is about strengthening our inner being so that when push comes to shove, we do the right thing. And I've seen this over and over again. I'm perplexed by this, actually. I was for a long time until I understood what Foucault was saying. Because, as someone who works on the front lines of hate violence here in the United States, I found something remarkable among Sikhs when I encountered them in the midst of hate crimes. And they had this beautiful response that I wasn't seeing consistently elsewhere. Every time there was a hate crime against a Sikh, then and now, as recently as the shooting in Indianapolis a few weeks ago, in which 4 Sikhs were killed, in every single instance, you find these people coming back and saying, what is the empathetic response? They're not being sucked into hate. How do we get there? This is a question that I kept asking myself. How do we get to that point personally? And to me, the reason that the Sikh community has, it's not that they have some special DNA or that they have some sacred gift from God. I think my thesis is that this is a community of people, by virtue of their distinct appearance in America, they've had to learn how to deal with racism, right? Just like my own experience from childhood, I've had to learn, how do I deal with this stuff in a way that I don't get sucked in to the toxicity of hate? And it's not an easy question, right? It's not something that you can just theorize. I mean, you can, but it doesn't really get you anywhere if you have it in your head. And it's not even something that you can take one day to the next and say, oh, I've now encountered it a couple of times. I understand how to do this, right? I have a lifetime of experience of dealing with hate on a regular basis, of dealing with racism on a regular basis. It's still hard. There's still no perfect answer every time. But the iterative behavior, the everyday practice of how am I going to show up in this world that reflects my values? Faith, love, integrity, service, success. Like, what am I going to do to show up? And sometimes those answers don't come out clearly, but I can tell you this, when those moments get really difficult, I have confidence now in a way that I didn't when I took that Snickers bar from the grocery store. I have confidence now that I will do the right thing because I have been doing the right thing. I have gotten better at it, and it's still not perfect. It probably will never be perfect, but it's better, it's stronger. And I think that's what Foucault is talking about when he's talking about technologies of the self. I want to share one more angle to this point around values-based living. And it's one that I never really anticipated, but it's one where I've actually found immense benefit. And so the account here is around how our values can save us. And this is something that I think can speak to a lot of our experiences, but also as we think about our families, our communities, our organizations, how they can serve us as well. And so I'll start with a very modern story about Twitter. I first joined Twitter in 2010. And being the nerd that I am, I saw it as a great platform for education and for activism. That's what I was excited about. I would love sharing views on justice, introducing people to fresh perspectives, and I didn't mind offering viewpoints that were different from others, and I didn't mind different viewpoints that I disagreed with too. I mean, I really appreciated the platform. And I didn't really know how to respond initially when I started getting hateful and racist tweets. I'd want to respond with something equally angry or hurtful, but I knew in my heart this wasn't constructive. And I also knew it wasn't in line with my values, but I just wasn't sure what else to do. So it was just a tough situation to be in. Sometimes I'd respond positively, sometimes I'd ignore. Sometimes I'd use humor, trying to show people the absurdity of their thinking. With all of this, the results varied, but one outcome remained the same for those first several months. And it was that each interaction would send off a long internal dialogue for me. It would suck up time. I would spend time on this. I would feel all sorts of emotions, anger, outrage, hope, confusion. I mean, it was exhausting. It was just way too much and way more than I wanted to be spending online, just talking to people. And it didn't really feel like it was worth it. And it was in the midst of this confusion that I received my first credible death threat since the racist backlash after 9/11. And it came via mail in an envelope. It was addressed to my home, which meant they knew where I lived. There was no return address. And I saw something in that envelope that freaked me out. And it was something I thought only happened in movies. Someone had cut out letters from magazines to spell out an entire letter, an entire hateful letter. So it wasn't one of those romantic magazines where you cut out some sort of collage. It was actually pretty scary, and it was even more scary to realize someone would take the time to create a letter like that, to put the effort into it, and that they knew where I lived. And that I went to bed feeling even more upset and frustrated and powerless than I usually did after online attacks. And I didn't know what I was supposed to do in a situation like this. Was dealing with the threats of violence in unavoidable attacks for racial minorities in this country. I didn't know how to think about it. And I could feel my mind spinning into negativity. And so to distract myself, I started scrolling through old photos on my phone, of course, right? The phone is the savior. And I scrolled right past our family's values document, the one that I just showed you. And something told me to go back and read through it a couple of times. I mean, for the millionth time. And it was in reading that I could feel my power return. And I'm reminded, as I say it out loud, of my mom's own situation at the roller skating rink, where she should have felt powerless, but she somehow claimed her own agency. I realized that I couldn't change how this person viewed me, but I could change and I could control how I chose to deal with the situation. And that's where I found my power. It's what saved me from feeling governed by fear and rage. And instead, I made the conscious decision to respond based on the 5 values. To live with faith would mean I wouldn't compromise the aspects of my religious appearance that bothered racists. To live with integrity meant that I would continue to do what I thought was right in terms of activism and racial justice. To live with love would mean that I would continue on the path that I was on, and loving people, my belief, loving people means showing them what they couldn't see on their own. To live with service would mean I would continue engaging with and educating people, not for my own benefit, but for the enrichment of those around me. And to live with excellence would mean to continue doing all of the above to the best of my abilities, fearlessly, unapologetically, and without compromising our family's security. Now, even just writing these out loud was a helpful exercise that helped me deal with that threat of violence. And it's helped me a lot over the years as those threats have increased. I've been reminded I don't have to sacrifice my family's safety to fight for justice. I've been reminded that as disempowered as I felt upon receiving those death threats, that's how empowered I could feel upon figuring out a plan of action that resonated with my values. So it wasn't the threat that stripped me of my agency and self-assuredness. It was my own uncertainty of how to deal with it. Now, I share this with you because knowing my values actually turned out to be my saving grace at a time when I felt completely lost and overwhelmed. Getting this clarity didn't happen immediately. It didn't happen on its own. It took intention and sustained effort, but it worked. And I no longer find myself infuriated or outraged by the hate that comes my way online or otherwise. And part of, I see we're getting to the close and into the Q&A section. The other thing I want to say is I've actually used these 5 principles to shape my online persona and my public persona because of 2 things. One, because our values are who we aspire to be. They set the tone for where we want to go. And also, if we are truly living into our values, then authenticity, living authentically, is to live with those values in mind in all the ways we show up in the world. Now, there's a really interesting thing that happened to me. Last story, I promise, and then we'll move to the Q&A. This really interesting thing that happened to me when I took my first job after completing my PhD. I did my PhD at Columbia in New York City, and then I moved to Texas to teach Islamic studies there. And I was the only person teaching Islam there. And you can imagine how confused Americans must have been that I was teaching a course on the Quran and had a Quran in my hand and then a turban on my head. And I was saying I wasn't a Muslim, but I was teaching Islam. I mean, yeah, very, very confused Americans in those few years. But one of the things that happened immediately after I got my job was a Muslim boy in Dallas was arrested in Dallas, Texas, for taking a clock to school that he had made at home. His teachers and then police officers thought that it was a bomb because he was Muslim. And so I, you know, like all Americans, this was a massive story in the US. It sent shockwaves around the country. And as part of my response, you know, I wanted to support the poor kid and his family. And I just posted on Twitter a photo of myself holding a clock, saying that I brought my clock to work as well in solidarity with this boy, Ahmed Mohammed. And the tweet that I put up, I didn't expect it to go viral, but it did. And it was on all the major news channels and TV shows in the States and across the world, Al Jazeera, BBC. And, you know, when something like that happens, you, at least for me, I try to put my phone away because it's just too overwhelming to deal with, right? If something goes viral. So I put my phone away, I show up to work the next day and I have a call from the president's office. And apparently there had been a whole campaign of people in Texas who were calling the university president asking that I be fired. And I didn't know what to do. I said, okay, well, tell me what you need from me. And they said, give us a couple of hours. We're going to review. And I didn't know what they were reviewing. So I just sat patiently. This was my dream job. I was moving back home to my hometown to be near my parents. I mean, I couldn't have wanted anything more. And now I might have lost my dream because of this social media post. And so I sat tight, waited for the phone to ring. And after 2 hours, it finally did. And the the vice president was calling me. And she said, we've reviewed everything and you know, we agree that you've done nothing wrong and we're here to support you. And I said, that's great, I appreciate it. Can you tell me what you reviewed? And she said that they reviewed my Twitter account and all of my social media profiles. They went back through my entire history to see what I had said, because apparently the people who had called for me to be fired were saying that I had a long history of posting angry and hateful material. Now, again, my saving grace here is that I had created a vision for myself, a plan for myself, that the way I wanted to show up online was in line with my values. But imagine if I hadn't. Imagine if I hadn't created a discipline for myself so that when I get these threats and these hateful messages, if I respond, and we know a lot of people do, and I understand why they do, it's natural, right? It's natural that you get bombarded with these hate messages, and at some point you're like, I don't want to deal with this anymore, and you just fire off something angry in response. I mean, leaders of countries have used Twitter like that, right? Like, how can we not? But fortunately, I don't know what it was, the presence of mind, perhaps, the wisdom to orient my online persona on the basis of values. And every time I tweet something with the values on my desktop, I ask myself, is this in line with what I want to say? And there are some times where I delete something that I've spent a lot of time on. There are also times that I've deleted things, not said things that I believe could have actually helped me grow a big platform or help me get into the public eye or get in touch with celebrities, all these things that we all want. But at the end of the day, it's not worth it for me. And in this moment where I almost lost my dream job, I realized what's really at stake, and also how do we use this to protect ourselves. So it's not an angle that I ever thought of when I was developing my values, but in a way we can think about it as risk management. that our values help us do the right thing. And by doing the right thing, we are preparing ourselves and protecting ourselves at the same time. So I'll pause here. I realize my last story took us a little bit over where we wanted to be, but hopefully it was a fun story for you all and something meaningful as well. So I'll pass it over to you, Praxia, if you want to take us the next direction.
Thank you so much. We'll just take a moment here. I want to give the opportunity to thank you, Simran. Thank you for being so generous and authentic with us in sharing your personal stories and sharing the learning that it came through each of those personal experiences and how you've integrated that into your work, into your character, into your being. And just thank you for offering this values-based vision for our own development and the development of our children. So much to reflect on. And also feels very energizing as you also share some very concrete practices that we can take to cultivate these values, to live them authentically so they really transform our lives and the lives of our friends and our family and our colleagues, really everyone we come into contact with. So thank you so much. So we do have, maybe we'll start with one question and then hopefully we'll get a few more that percolate up here. But one question that came through the chat, Simran, is from Ling, and her question is really about, I think if it gets to the heart of the question, is really about how schools can support students in living their values through practices and daily interactions. So perhaps as a family, one of our values is honesty, or one of our values is being inclusive, but maybe when kids come to school, there's a pressure to cheat or to be a part of cliques or to exclude others. So, how do schools help students check in with those personal values that they have and be upstanding, perhaps even in living those? I hope I got that right, Ling. If not, please add more to the chat.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And, it's as someone who's living in the United States and who is seeing where our country has fallen. It's something that I think about a lot, actually. I guess the reason I think about it is because growing up, our understanding of racism was that racism is just ignorance. And so what we told ourselves was to solve racism, to solve all the inequities of our world, all we really need to do is educate people. And then I grow up, right? This is my understanding as a kid. Then I grow up and I look around at the world and I say, wait, we are the most educated society in human history. Globally, we are more educated as a human species than we ever have been before. And look at where we are. I mean, it's mind-boggling. And so the question is not, it's not, will education save us? It's what kind of education will save us? What are we missing, right? Something is missing in the way we think about how we raise our kids. And so that's why I appreciate the question, as I have my 3-year-old and my 5-year-old, and I'm trying to figure out how to raise them in this world that feels like it's on fire. I think that's the question of our times. What are we doing to instill the values in our kids in ways that, for us, it may very much have been accidental or at the very best anomalous, right? We didn't get this evenly, and it's because it wasn't prioritized. And so the question, I think, just for me, is a question about priorities. Where do we prioritize? And what do we prioritize as societies? And I think for too long, we have prioritized information, knowledge, thinking that it would lead to our liberation. And while it has taken us to some pretty amazing places, we've actually compromised quite a bit along the way. I don't think we have to compromise knowledge in order to prepare ourselves with ethical formation. That's the compromise we've made. I don't think we have to. But where do we begin? I think we have to start earlier. I think my parents really started when we were when we were sort of 10, 11 or so. So fourth or fifth grade is where they, as I've talked to them, that's when they thought it was age appropriate. And now the science is showing us that we start earlier than that. And so 5 years old, kindergarten onwards is a perfectly appropriate place to start. The second thing I'll say there is, how do we do this? I think we have to open ourselves up to a more humanistic approach that allows for malleability, that allows for internal diversity within our kids. And so one of the challenges is that the models that we create around social emotional learning are often rigid, and we try and force or at least impose the way that we think things should be onto our kids. And I think what's more powerful, and what I've experienced myself, is if we can open it up to our own kids and let them set the path and say, this is what matters to me, and then support them in implementing whatever they think matters. I think that goes so much further. And I think that's something we've seen bear out pedagogically. That's something behavioral psychology shows us as well. And so I think that's something that I look forward to seeing in schools as we develop.
Thanks so much, Simran. Yeah, I think, a lot of what you said resonates. At ISKL, we have this motto, we call it the Mellowati way, which is about taking care of yourself, taking care of each other, and taking care of this place. And that starts with our really young kids. And so I think about how, as a school culture, we try to stay consistent with that. And that's a way for kids to get anchored back into their values and think about what that really looks like for them in different particular moments. Okay, we've got some great questions here. So we have a question about teaching values to your own children, Simran. So are you teaching them the same values that your family and your parents taught you? And how do you do that? Do you read them stories, or how do you teach those values with your own children?
Oh, it's a good question. My 3-year-old is probably a little too young to grasp. She's starting to grasp some of the issues. So my kids are young. I guess that's the place I should start. I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. I think most 20-year-olds don't know what integrity means, so I don't expect them to. But I think there are ways to, and I know there are ways, because we do this at home, to translate larger ideas in age-appropriate ways. And maybe the best word for it is to say we distill it, because I don't think we're watering it down. I don't think we are, we're even adapting the language to suit their needs, but really what we're doing is to speak about these issues in ways that my 5-year-old can understand. And so actually, the first example that's coming to my mind is this weekend, my 5-year-old lied to me for the first time. And we have for quite some time been talking about the importance of telling the truth, and how being honest is more important than actually being dishonest is worse than actually misbehaving. And so I saw her, she's the softest kid in the world. She's really sensitive. And so for the first time I saw her hitting her younger sister when she was frustrated. And she saw me see her in the same way that my mom saw me at the grocery store take the Snickers bar. And she tried to tell me that I was trying to give her a hug, I wasn't hitting. And so we had a long conversation about dishonesty. And it wasn't, this is what I've learned through my own teaching and parenting. It wasn't a lecture, but it was talking about it in terms of what's important, what are our priorities, how do we live in this family. Now, one of the challenges is that the kids around her do things that she's not allowed to do sometimes, that go up against our family values and the way we talk about them. So she's seen her friends lie. And so what do you do about that? How do you raise kids to live within their values without judging other people and saying, oh, that kid is a bad kid, right? This is how kids think, right? 5-year-olds are very black and white. And so the natural impulse for them is to say, oh, that kid is a bad kid because he lies. I've heard him lie before. And that's a harder conversation. And the way that my wife and I have come to approach it is to say different families have different rules. These are the rules of our families, of our family. And so we do talk about these things as rules, which is a little bit rigid for my liking, but it's the type of framework that a 5-year-old can understand. And my hope is that as she gets older, as we've already started to do, we can start scaffolding and making it more complex for her to grasp. So that's a long answer to your short question. The short answer is it's very difficult, and I have no idea what I'm doing as a parent, and so hopefully we'll figure it out. But yeah, that's pretty much what we're doing.
I have a few more questions here. So I guess sort of building on this idea of honesty, a question from Doug, who's a parent and our middle school assistant principal. How do you embrace the values of honesty in what essentially is sort of a post-truth world, in a world where there's often even a denial of facts or reality?
As challenging as it can be, and as many problems as this can cause, there's some opportunity here. And I think part of the opportunity that I see is that in a post-enlightenment context, we're hypersensitive. We're socialized to be hypersensitive to this idea that there is one true answer to everything, right? If I think back on my education, you go through math and you have one right answer. You go through the scientific method and you try and find the solution, right? We're so focused on singular perspectives and our own truths that we lose sight of the fact that different people have different perspectives. And I think that's become a real challenge of our times, right? Like this very idea of supremacy is born out of this idea that, you know, we have access to truth that you don't, and therefore we're better than you. And so while there are all sorts of problems, and Doug, I don't disagree with your sort of concern with the sort of what we're seeing in terms of the post-truth moment. There's an opportunity here for us to develop a little bit of humility and to actually recognize that people who have a different conception of reality than us, it's not just because they're crazy or because they're dumb, right? That's how we typically dismiss people's perspectives. A lot of times, these people who think differently than us, it's their view of the world, and we have to take it seriously. And so there's a chance for us to actually learn how to empathize with people who have different perspectives than us, even if we completely disagree with them. And it's hard, right? It's difficult. I try to do it, and sometimes I'm able to, and sometimes I'm not. But I think there's some merit to that, at least.
It could be sometimes not necessarily agreeing with the idea, but saying, you know, I really appreciate that you're asking these questions, or I really appreciate the way you're seeking evidence in this moment. Or I don't know, sometimes I find when we have really different perspectives, it can be about not trying to convince one another of the truth of the idea, but trying to understand the ways we're thinking and how there's commonality in the ways we're thinking, or trying to make sense of our world. Just a thought as you were talking about that, Simran. Okay, a few more questions. Great question. Ha has a question. Could you please educate us on the difference between being religious and having faith?
This is one of those where I would say different words have different meanings for different people. For me, what it means to me is probably to say religious versus having faith is to be religious is to follow an organized religious tradition, perhaps, versus having faith. I think is more of a cliche or a term that people often use to say that they have hope that things will work out without assigning it to a larger structure or even necessarily to a higher power. I think that's probably how I would describe the difference, but I also recognize that, you ask 100 people that question, they'll have 100 different answers. Yeah, I think that's probably my reaction to that question.
The other part of this question that Ha brings up is around how to help children navigate differences in beliefs. When we raise them maybe with a particular, within a religious tradition or within a certain faith group, how do we support our kids in both tolerating, understanding differences in the space of belief?
Yeah, I think that's a really tough question, because it's something we struggle with as adults as well, and not just the worst of us, the best of us struggle with this too, right? And so it's a real question. The way that one way that I've found to be effective is to simply open up for kids the possibility that different people have different ways of understanding the world, and that you don't have to judge their perspectives. And so I think here's one of the things I've learned both as a teacher and as a parent. Oftentimes we get so lost in trying to share our understanding of the world that we don't realize sometimes we're mapping our assumptions or our problems onto our kids. And so for my own kids, and as I've worked with other young kids as well, they don't necessarily have the second part of this equation at play in their minds, right? For my kids, I could simply say that's another way of understanding the world. We talk about it as possibility, so I'll say that's a possibility, and so we'll talk through a different perspective. So for instance, in our tradition, we don't really focus on heaven or hell. We don't know what happens after we die. So when my daughter asked about this the other day, and she said, well, my friend David was talking about going to heaven, I talked to her about it as a possibility, and we talked through the belief system and what it looks like. And we talked about whether she thought it was possible or not, and she did. And then we said, okay, cool. If something comes up around, more Eastern traditions, like in Hinduism or Buddhism, we'll entertain those similarly. But it's almost like, to me at least, it's almost like you position yourself with your own orientation towards the world. And then you view other perspectives from the outside, and you say, okay, cool. This is another way of someone positioning themselves. And so, it's a way of saying we don't necessarily have to tell our kids that one way is better or worse, that one way is true or not. Those are things that we can let them sort out for themselves when they're ready.
Thank you. Okay, so I think, great. These are some really good questions. I think we have time for probably one more. This is a question about I think goes back to the family mission statement and the values compass. So the question is really, setting it and stating it is one thing, but how do you stay grounded? How do you realign to the path when maybe people in the family or you have strayed from it? Like, how do you know when it's time to recalibrate? Maybe what's normal? I think about this question a little bit of what's normal and what's like a red flag that indicates for us maybe we need to realign or recalibrate.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm actually going through a recalibration myself as we speak. So I'll tell you what that looks like for me. But before I even do that, I'll tell you how do we make sure that it's not just something that we set and then forget about. I think it's daily practice, and so what I try and do, and what I would encourage everyone to do, is once you identify what those core values are, to set a daily practice for each of them. What is one thing? Make it achievable, right? What is one thing I will do today to practice service or honesty or whatever the values are that you identify? It doesn't have to be anything magnanimous, but just a daily practice. And I think that's part of what helps you keep it grounded. In terms of accountability, I think there are a few things I would say. One is it's really important to have personal accountability. For me, what that looks like is there are two books in particular that I turn to, and I try and reread every year that I find especially helpful in daily practice. And so I turn to those two books. I'm finishing the second one today, actually, this evening. And I also once a year sit down and look through my values and my practices and just check in on where I'm going. So those are probably obvious. Now the harder one, and the one that I don't like as much, is having accountability partners who are aware of what my goals are, what my values are, and they stay in touch with me to ensure that I'm on the right track. And what it looks like in practice is when things are good, it's all good. And so it's not painful at all. The accountability really comes in when I have close friends or family who are observing what I'm up to, and they're like, you know what, you're off course a little bit. And of course, my natural response is to be defensive and to give the excuses for why this is a one-time thing or whatever it is, but it's never really the case. Like they all know me better. And so it actually is painful, but I think that's a really important element here, because as we sort of discussed from the outset of this conversation, it's so easy to play mind games with ourselves, to trick ourselves into saying, you know, I'm on the right track, and we're really totally off. And so the accountability partners are probably the most helpful practice that a lot of us tend to skip.
Thanks, Simran. That's we having to have like a lot of humility, I think, when we have to recalibrate, right? And those accountability partners can help with that. There's a question here that is coming from one of our ISKL middle school counselors, Jen. She said, I'm curious about the two books that you reread each year. Would you be willing to share?
Oh, sure. Yeah, one is The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. I for whatever reason, I just really resonate with that perspective. The other one is James Clear has a book called Atomic Habits. And what I really love about that book is its emphasis on process versus outcomes, which I think is really what we're trying to get at here. I haven't told you once what the goal should be or how to measure goals. It's not like that. I think that's at least for me, that hasn't seemed to be the way of the world. And so yeah, those are the two books. I found them incredibly instructive for my own life.
All right, put those in the chat. We'll see if the Amazon upticks on those. We'll see in a few days. Okay, I think we have one more question, which is really about any advice or strategies you might have, Simran, as you think about, you're an educator, and here we are, we're a school, and we're having this parent talk around values and supporting values at school. Any advice on a strategy that you've seen work well between parents and a school in supporting values within a school context?
Yeah, I mean, it's within these relationships with schools and parents, transparency is important, and schools are typically good about that. Communication is important. That's where things tend to break down a little bit, right? Like, do you actually, maybe your school does, because your school is different, but most schools I work with, they don't really communicate about values. It tends to be actually minutia and events that schools and parents are typically focused on. And so, are you spending time here? Is the priority here in your communications? And then the third thing is really engagement and accountability. What does the relationship look like? Who is holding who accountable? Where does the parent community have an opportunity to hold the school accountable, which is typically the way the conversation goes, but then also to flip it. in what ways does the school hold the parents accountable? And usually the dynamic isn't such that there's an opportunity for that, but I think it is incredibly important to figure out a way to open up those lines of communication, and then actually have some follow through in terms of accountability.
Yeah, so kind of co-creating that system of accountability. If these are our shared values at ISKL, how does that show up in our canteen area, in the classroom, in the hallways, at home, on the play fields, all these different places, right? And it is about communication and thinking about what it looks like daily in practice. It's so empowering. So, all right, we are at 10 o'clock and we are just about at our conclusion. So once again, I want to thank you all. I hope we covered most of the questions. If we didn't get to any question, please reach out to us in the communications team. I think we can drop the email into the chat here. So you can have a chance to share your questions if we didn't get to them. Thank you again, Simran, for this wonderful session. We really hope that this talk really empowers everyone who's listening in. We have a tradition here at ISKL that when we close our sessions, we all unmute, we wave, we turn on our videos, we say goodbye to show each other our faces. So let's do that now. Let's give Professor Singh a proper ISKL farewell. And thank you so much, Simran. Thank you for being with us, and we wish you well and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you
so much.
Thank you. Such a great session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Wonderful. Thank you.